Manchester is carrying out a vigorous campaign against the evils of slum conditions. A programme of clearing 15,000 bad houses and providing a similar number of good dwellings in a period of 5 years is the aim of the City Council.
Hello, good evening, and welcome to Hulme, Manchester, Great Britain. So, it is my immense honour to say to all you slum dwellers, your prayers have been answered. Welcome to paradise!
This is a story of a neighbourhood that underwent one of the most radical changes in history, when it was demolished almost completely to make way for a new utopian vision. A vision that sought to reimagine urban life by mixing the benefits of high-density, low-cost living with the benefits of rural life. But this neighbourhood wasn't demolished and rebuilt once. It happened twice. Yet today, in its third incarnation, it's not only doing better, but it's fast becoming one of the most desirable places to live for miles around. So, how did this happen? This district just south of Manchester city centre is one of the most dynamic, characterful, exciting and colourful as they come. It's bohemian, it's sporty, it's hippie and it's green. It's embracing of the future. It's gritty, it's open, it's fluid, and it's soulful. And at its heart are its people, 10,000 faces with 10,000 stories to tell in over 100 different languages. It's new, it's old, it's very mainstream, and it's defiantly alternative. It's incredibly convenient for walking to the city centre, yet it's always been overlooked by those seeking trendier places to live, where big developers want to make fat stacks of cash. This place is a hidden gem in plain sight. Its story is very much the story of Britain. The history of Britain, after all, isn't the story of the wealthiest in our society, of the millionaires and billionaires and the monarchs that seem to make all the headlines. This isn't the district for those people anyway. The history of humanity is the story of ordinary people living and struggling and changing the world one tiny step at a time, usually through necessity. The story of humanity is best told through the people the history books often shove to the background, to those at the bottom that live and die without fanfare. This is human. This is Hulme. Often described as one of Britain's worst slums, the Victorian terraced houses that once dominated the area were swept away by the City Council in the 1960s as part of a programme of urban renewal that was both optimistic and visionary. In their place appeared radical new modernist developments that earnestly tried to foster a sense of community. Such developments based upon something called deck access, or streets in the sky, would be an ideal way to structure working class homes while retaining a close sense of the neighbourliness that existed before. But within a single generation, Hulme lost both its Victorian era housing and the daring new developments that came after, themselves descended into slums. Hulme had become a byword for the poor social housing schemes of the 1960s and a cautionary tale for all that followed. Not just here, but across Europe. So what happened? Was this just bad planning? Or is it just hard to force a community to thrive when creating one from almost scratch? Hulme sits directly south of what many people would consider to be Manchester city centre. The large Mancunian Way flyover makes a handy barrier between the two. But because it also touches the two most important rivers in the area, the Irwell and the Medlock, Hulme has been part of the history of this land for further back than most people realise. It was through here that the Roman road from Chester was laid, leading to the cradle of Manchester's existence, the fort at Castlefield, on a high point of land on the other side of the Medlock, overlooking the green marshland that will one day become Hulme. Manchester remained relatively insignificant for centuries, all of its history really bunched up into the last 250 years or so. In the 18th century, industrialisation began in Britain, and Manchester not only found itself involved, but blazing the trail. As the centre of the industrialised world for a time, Manchester's population boomed from 3,700 in 1650 to 303,000 in 1851. This was a shock to the system, and the city grew rapidly and without a grand plan. In order to house all the people coming into the city to live and work, vast areas surrounding the city centre were given over to the building of latticed streets of red brick terraced houses. By the 1850s, there were over 50,000 people living in the tiny area of Hulme alone, which would have placed it in the top 30 largest towns in the country had it not been part of Manchester. Although at first its terraced houses were built to a reasonably high standard, the pace of demand and the lack of regulation governing the quality of housing meant that the more that were built, the worse they got. As expected, Hulme was almost completely a residential area for working class people, most of whom existed in dire poverty in cold, damp housing without decent sanitation. As a result, Hulme's reputation inside and outside Manchester was that of disease, decay, and death. It was often referred to as hell on earth. But one thing it had going for it was a strong sense of collectivism. People looking out for one another, for their neighbours and friends. It was a struggle, but they were in it together. Fast forward to the end of the Second World War, and a threadbare, emotionally exhausted Britain found itself in an emerging housing crisis. Large numbers of homes in urban areas had been destroyed, and the population had experienced a surge of new arrivals, known later as the baby boomers. Thankfully, that collective spirit that had been cultivated during the Victorian era by working class communities had become the wave upon which Britain's victory in the war had been won. As Britain went into the new post-war era, that collectivism pushed authorities to think about making changes that would benefit the most downtrodden in society. Councils across the country began looking at ways to rebuild not only what had been damaged in the war, but to turn their attention to certain areas and start afresh. There was a sense of utopianism, an idea that authorities now had a chance to design working class communities in the perfect way. Open, clean, green, and pleasing on the eye, all the while retaining that close sense of community.
It does, of course, mean factory-built houses, but factory-built houses can be just as good as production line cars, and I think we're going to move to this.
In 1945, the Manchester Corporation published a long-term plan that described Hulme as endless rows of grimy houses. No gardens, no parks, no community buildings, no hope. Getting rid of the terraces and replacing them with new deck access blocks was only part of the plan for Hulme. Small industries in the area would be located elsewhere, and some of the roads would be widened and made more suitable for the era of the car. To create more breathing space, over 2/3 of people living in Hulme would have to be moved elsewhere too, leaving around 20,000. By the early 1960s, all the remaining terraced houses had been demolished. Very few buildings from before this era still exist today, like rare monuments of a past civilization. Now, while the clearance of slum houses that were inadequate for giving residents a decent quality of life seems like only a good thing, there were sharp negative consequences too. The psychological impact of seeing the area they might have lived in their entire life razed to the ground can be harrowing, especially for older residents. And for children growing up during that decade of dereliction, the effect of so much destruction would have been even worse. What good does it do a child to play in acres of rubble, to expect no social mobility, to be raised by fragments of a community? Yet the new modernist, sometimes brutalist utopia was arriving in all of its straight-line, blocky concrete glory. Sadly, all of it was undermined by the speed upon which it was all built, and ultimately the budget set by the government. The fact is that this type of architecture and design was new and largely untested, as were, crucially, the building materials and methods. The new housing was made as cheaply as possible and as quickly as possible, laying the foundation for problems occurring not too far down the line. By the late 1960s, developments had varied somewhat from the original concepts in the 1945 plan, but Hulme did find itself victim to the giddy redevelopment of the road system around the city centre, trapped between the new Mancunian Way to the north and the new Princess Parkway to the east. Many of the original plans for community buildings, surrounded by lots of greenery and parkland, were never realised. As a result, the new Hulme was quickly becoming isolated. At the heart of the redevelopment were these 4 huge crescents, built with a streets in the sky model completely at the core of their philosophy. They were enormous, long snake-like buildings, several stories high. All were connected by high walkways or, at the very least, wide open areas at their centre. Unlike the traditional tower block where someone could live for weeks on end without bumping into a neighbour, the deck access design of Hulme Crescents allowed neighbours to share a common space outside their front doors, taking several traditional Victorian streets and simply raising them on top of one another. But the concrete walkways were cold, hard and unwelcoming, and because they were passageways, many residents still didn't have private outdoor space to make their own, save for a tiny balcony with hardly any room. As a result, nobody really socialised on them, except children, who had nowhere else to go. For older kids and teenagers, fun could only be found in the semi-dereliction of the parts of Hulme still not developed, or on the range of grass at the centre of the crescents themselves, where young people would gather from far afield, sometimes catching up, sometimes just hanging out, sometimes getting into trouble. Whereas older people were left bewildered by the new Hulme, younger people made the best of what they had, creating the impression that the area was a little wild and unrestrained. Now, since most of the old Hulme residents had been moved to new council estates further afield, and the concrete decks were not good communal spaces, the entire reason for the Crescent's design was undermined. The sense of community here had not developed, and in fact, was only degenerating. In 1975, only 3 years after their opening, the design flaws were already becoming acute, and the reputation of the Crescents was plummeting considerably. More than 95% of residents surveyed said they wanted to leave the Crescents altogether. The Crescents are gone today, but a very similar development in Sheffield called Park Hill still survives, and despite its clever redevelopment in recent years, it provides an invaluable insight into why Hulme Crescents may have failed. The truth is, this type of architecture isn't human-friendly. The cold concrete simplicity runs contrary to the human instinct to find comfort in shelter. The decks were hard, grey, and too close together to allow much sunlight. It was hard to enjoy them, let alone make them feel like home. The walkways between buildings were high and narrow, their staircases tight and dark. The flats themselves suffered in the cold, damp climate of northern England. Because of the shape of the buildings, it was feared that the damage of a single explosion might be amplified many times, and so the Crescents went without gas in favour of electric heating, which in the 1970s was a lot more expensive. As a result, tenants struggled to pay to heat those cold concrete flats, and many just didn't bother, unless the weather was especially unbearable. And there were other problems with the construction that kept popping up, including asbestos scares, poor lighting, and accessibility for people with wheelchairs, prams, or walking sticks. A new kind of problem now began to plague Hulme: crime. Troubled families from outside of the area had been encouraged to take residence in the new redevelopment schemes, and many of them began to dominate the small neighbourhoods. After riots in neighbouring Moss Side in 1981, there was also an increased number of heroin users living in Hulme, which increased crime from shoplifting right to physical assaults and rape. Once again, the design of the deck access developments created the ideal environment for crime to fester. Narrow decks and walkways made good places for muggings to take place, especially at night, while gangs of young men liked to congregate in the open spaces between the buildings. The Crescents especially became frightening places to be at night for many residents, where even police dared not patrol. And by this time, it wasn't just the police that had given up, but the council too. It had become obvious that this type of development wasn't good for families, and more flats began to be occupied by people without families, by single men attracted by the very low rents, and students encouraged to live there by the universities, who had a shortage of student accommodation. Because of this, Hulme slowly began to transform once again. While it remained high in criminality and a general feeling of isolation, it was also beginning to attract a more bohemian feel. Artists, poets, musicians found residence on the fringes of Hulme's dereliction. It was here on the corner of Royce Road and Claiborne Street, at the Russell Club near the Crescents themselves, that a night began called Factory, staged by Tony Wilson and Alan Erasmus. For many rock and post-punk bands of the era, including local Durruti Column and Joy Division, both of which were managed by Wilson. At the time, popular music was dominated by prog rock and disco, which Wilson thought didn't speak to the youth of Northern Britain. The mellow, angst-ridden tunes of bands like Joy Division reflected the attitudes of teenagers in places such as Hulme, where rebelliousness against the post-World War II social and family order blended with a lack of optimism for a brighter future. Teens of the late 70s and early 80s in the North weren't just rebelling against their strict parents, but against a society that had taken away their future. This period saw a huge loss of manufacturing up and down Britain, as companies took jobs abroad to save money on wages, and politicians dropped manufacturing in favour of a neoliberal economic model. Hulme itself had already lost all of its small industry and traditional working class trades, and so when the sector collapsed across Britain and laissez-faire capitalism took hold, this only spelled more disaster. Unemployment rocketed, bringing with it crime and a drug economy. And to rub salt in the wound, Hulme's reputation was so low that people living in Hulme were often treated as second-class citizens elsewhere in the city. It became harder to find a job with a Hulme postcode. Healthcare wasn't as good, social mobility had virtually dropped to zero.
Do you think Hulme should ever have been built in the first place?
No, of course it shouldn't. It's an absolute disaster, it's a mistake, and it shouldn't have been planned and it shouldn't have been built.
The formidable campaigning of residents' groups had pressurised authorities to make improvements. But by the late 80s, the council could neither afford to refurbish the flats or knock them down, and instead just stopped charging rents altogether. Between the artists, the students and the squatters, this produced an interesting mix of people now living in Hulme, with a quarter having degrees and diplomas, and a third having no qualifications whatsoever. By the early 1990s, Hulme was one of Britain's worst slum areas, once again, plagued by poverty and destitution, low health and high crime. Its now diverse community had suffered at the hands of a racist police force, the prejudice of outsiders, and the general malaise of the city council to improve things. Yet, amongst all that, it had been a place for various different subcultures to take root, to coexist in an almost self-regulating way. Despite the poverty and the crime, despite the loss of the traditional community and the failure to provide for so many people, Hulme still hung together somehow, a new community developing in the rubble of the latter. In the mid-1990s, a decision was made to redevelop Hulme yet again, using lessons from the previous time to get it right. The Crescents, tower blocks and most of the concrete brutality was demolished, but this time, using research and learning that involved current residents and what they wanted to see, a better Hulme finally began to emerge. What's odd about this story isn't that the council got the redevelopment wrong, it's that they actually stumbled across the right answer to the problem before the 1945 plan had even been conceived. In the 1930s, while slum clearances were getting underway, the Manchester Corporation replaced many of its old red brick terraces with these much larger council houses on nicer estates. These houses were well built, with gardens at the front and back, and still survive today in neighbouring parts of the city. But because they were so good, their rents were quite high, making them unaffordable for the poorest council tenants in the worst slum areas, such as Hulme. As an alternative, some Hulme residents campaigned the council to build small blocks of flats, just 2 or 3 stories high, like were being developed in parts of Europe. These small blocks of red brick flats were built with open spaces and balconies. Built in the 1940s, they were family-friendly, child-friendly, and they still exist today. Through the roughest times, these flats became places of high crime and avoided by anyone who knew the area. They were, after all, right next to the Crescents. But they weren't knocked down like concrete Hulme because their ethos was just kind of right. They would work if given the opportunity. They were a great example of cheap housing that retained a sense of neighbourliness. And even though this pocket of Hulme is still one of deprivation, the flats act as a glue holding the community together, not tearing it apart. And so properties like these became a good blueprint for taking into the rest of Hulme. Large developments were shunned in favour of more medium-density apartment buildings, encouraging the involvement of tenants and owners in residents' associations. Community focal points were created, including several small parks in the centre, where murals to the area's past tried to promote a sense of pride. And away from the main roads, there was a return to the low residential homes that had been there 100 years before, but this time better built, better maintained, and better serviced. Then there's the Zion and Nyamos centres for performing arts, as well as Hulme Community Garden Centre and allotments, a green oasis like no other in Manchester. Opposite is a pottery school, and the only place around here you can actually buy and drink alcohol these days, Kim's. Manchester Metropolitan University's Burley campus is flanked by aesthetically pleasing student accommodation, and an area that encourages walking and cycling. Now there are still remnants of the old Hulme, and yes, it's not perfect, but such imperfections add character to an area, and arguably serve to perfect it. If there is any lesson to learn about why Hulme's slum clearances just led to more slums, it's a complicated one. But fundamentally, money is at its core. The 1960s redevelopment was top-down and didn't involve people from the area having a say. Large schemes were built cheaply and quickly using poor materials. Little money was put into maintenance and repair, even less money was invested in working class communities such as Hulme to help with education, policing and health. The loss of manufacturing across the north was also largely a money-saving decision. We hear a lot about Hulme Crescents and other concrete architecture that let Hulme down. But the buildings weren't really to blame. Buildings are just buildings. Hulme fell into deprivation because it was literally deprived of funds, of investment, of opportunities. And we can reflect on the high concept 1945 plans and the plans of those that were actually built in the 1960s and see that this type of community design isn't necessarily unworkable. Neighbourhoods designed around community focal points, open green areas and good public transport are still the ideal. Instead, Hulme fell victim to the same two things that plagued city design throughout the world during the mid-20th century. Building things as cheaply as possible and an obsession with cars over mass transit. Today, it is still largely working class and residential, but crime is incredibly low, and it's an area for families once again. Little things, like better lighting, help women feel safer walking alone at night. Better public transport help everyone find work across Greater Manchester. After all, this is a community of school teachers and healthcare workers, carers, and charity volunteers. And don't get me wrong, Hulme still faces the same battles against deprivation as the rest of the country. Its council houses slowly being eaten away by vulture landlordism and the government's right to buy scheme that sells publicly owned houses to private ownership for cheaper than they are worth. But it's still an iconic example of what a little public sector investment can do for a community. But aside from the money, ultimately what made Hulme a success is the people. They've endured generational changes that others across Britain haven't had to deal with. And they've not only held it together, but they've got stuck in, led from the front, and now they thrive. In this day and age, with so much thrown at us to divide and segment us, the fact that a diversely populated inner city area in Britain is flourishing is a testament to the character of Hulme. And no doubt hard times may come again one day, but Hulme's fate now seems to lie in a new direction. Its next challenge may not be about warding off poverty, but to survive the hands of gentrification, of becoming the victim of being too good a place to live.